The morning fog rolls in from the Pacific, soft and gray, threading through the streets of San Francisco like a quiet breath. It is the early 1970s, and the city is a patchwork of old Victorian houses, steep hills, and the distant clang of cable cars. The air carries the tang of salt and the faint sweetness of sourdough bread baking somewhere near the wharf. Light falls gently on pastel-painted facades, and the world seems to be waking up slowly, one window at a time. In this city of dreamers and drifters, change is in the air, subtle, unhurried, like the fog itself. Harvey Milk steps off a train not as a young man seeking fortune, but as someone in his early 40s, with a life already lived in other places. He was born in 1930 on Long Island, the second son of Jewish parents, a boy who loved opera and horses and the feel of a well-tailored jacket. He served in the Navy, taught high school math, worked for a Wall Street investment firm, but none of it felt like his own skin. He had a restless energy, a longing for something real. He carried that longing westward, across the continent, until he reached the edge of the land. He arrives in San Francisco with his partner, Scott Smith, in 1972. They have little money, a handful of belongings, and an idea to open a small business. The city greets them with its steep, narrow streets and rows of colorful houses that seem to lean together like old friends. They find a rundown storefront on Castro Street, a neighborhood that is just beginning to stir with a new sense of identity. The area is populated by working-class Irish families, but a wave of newcomers is drifting in: artists, writers, and a quiet community of people who have come here because they have heard it is a place where they can be themselves. Harvey looks at the storefront with its dusty windows and peeling paint, and he sees more than a business. He sees a living room for the neighborhood. He and Scott hang a sign that reads Castro Camera, and they fill the small space with photographic equipment, film rolls, and developing chemicals. The back half of the shop becomes their living quarters, a cramped but cozy nest with a hot plate and a mattress on the floor. Through the front window, the morning light streams in, illuminating the floating dust like tiny stars. It is a simple beginning, the kind that looks small but holds a seed of something much larger. The neighborhood itself feels like a character in this quiet story. Its Victorian houses, built after the gold rush, stand with ornate trim and bay windows, painted in shades of buttery yellow, robin's egg blue, and soft lavender. At sunrise, the light catches the glass and turns each window into a miniature sun, casting golden rectangles onto the sidewalks. The streets slope dramatically toward the bay, and from certain corners you can see the red towers of the Golden Gate Bridge peeking through the mist. This is a place of breathtaking, everyday beauty, where even a morning walk to the corner bakery feels like a scene from a painting. Inside Castro Camera, the days unfold with a gentle rhythm. The scent of chemicals mixes with the aroma of percolating coffee. Harvey rearranges the displays, polishes the glass, and greets everyone who passes by. He is a talker, a man who listens with his whole body, leaning in close and nodding, making people feel seen. He asks about their lives, their partners, their jobs, their sorrows. The shop becomes a gathering spot, a safe harbor where conversation flows like a warm current. People come in to buy film but stay for the feeling of belonging. In the evenings, the fog often returns, muffling the street sounds into a soft hum. Harvey might step outside and look up at the sky, where the first stars push through the gray. He is thinking about more than photography now. He is beginning to sense that this neighborhood, this community of people who have been invisible for so long, needs a voice. The thought settles into his mind like the fog settling over the hilltops, steadily, silently, and with a kind of inevitability. It is the beginning of a transformation, the quiet before a gentle awakening. Castro Camera was never really just a camera shop. It sat at 575 Castro Street, a modest storefront with a large window that faced the waking neighborhood. Every morning, Harvey would pull up the metal grate, unlock the glass door, and let the cool, salty air of the Pacific wash in. He arranged the shelves with care, placing the newest Kodak film boxes just so, letting the morning light catch their yellow and red packaging. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, and the ceiling was low enough to feel like a protective shell. From the back, you could hear the percolating coffee, a soft bubbling that promised a fresh cup to anyone who walked through the door. It felt more like a kitchen than a retail space. The walls of the shop displayed photographs taken by local residents, portraits of couples holding hands, gatherings in Dolores Park, and the architectural details of the neighborhood's best-kept homes. Harvey encouraged everyone to see themselves as artists, and the walls became a living gallery of everyday life. In a corner, a stack of community newspapers offered news the mainstream press ignored. A bulletin board overflowed with handwritten notes, someone offering a free couch, someone looking for a roommate, a poster for a potluck dinner at the Metropolitan Community Church. The whole space hummed with quiet human connection, the kind that grows stronger simply because people are seen. Harvey's own presence filled the shop like a warm light. He was a solid man, with a thick mustache and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He moved slowly, deliberately, never rushing. He would lean against the counter and listen, truly listen, to whoever came in. It might be a young person new to the city, terrified and hopeful in equal measure, or an older neighbor who remembered when the Castro had a different rhythm. Harvey had a gift for making people feel that their stories mattered. He asked gentle questions, remembered names, and always offered a cup of coffee. In that small space, a community began to knit itself together. The shop served as a sort of safe living room for people who had left behind families that wouldn't accept them, or small towns that had pushed them out. As the afternoons lengthened, the light would shift, casting long, mellow shadows across the floor. People would gather inside, sometimes sitting on stacks of photo albums because there weren't enough chairs. Conversations would drift from the mundane, a recipe for sourdough, a broken bicycle chain, to the deeply personal, coming out stories, lost loves, the quiet ache of loneliness. Harvey never steered the talk. He simply held the space open, and the space itself did the healing. The neighborhood outside was transforming too. More and more people from the LGBTQ+ community were moving in, drawn by word of mouth, by letters from friends, by the sheer magnetism of a place where you could walk hand in hand without fear. The old-timers and the newcomers learned to live side by side, and slowly the Castro developed a unique character, a blend of Victorian elegance and bohemian warmth. Every afternoon, the sun would angle through the tall eucalyptus trees in the park up the street, and the light would scatter into a million golden motes that drifted through the shop's open door. Harvey, however, was beginning to notice that safety was a fragile thing. He heard stories from his customers about losing jobs because of who they loved, about being evicted without warning, about the casual cruelty of a world that still saw them as dangerous or sick. He saw police raiding bars where people simply gathered to dance, and he felt a simmering sense of injustice beneath his gentle exterior. It wasn't anger that moved him, it was a deep, patient resolve. He believed that visibility was the antidote to fear. If people knew their neighbors were like them, the walls of misunderstanding might come down, brick by brick. So the camera shop began to change, too, becoming a makeshift campaign headquarters long before any official race was declared. Harvey started holding community meetings right there among the tripods and the film canisters. Mismatched chairs were pulled into a circle, and the conversations grew more purposeful. What if we could get a stop sign put in at a dangerous intersection? What if we could have a voice at City Hall? These were small, practical questions, but they carried an enormous hope. The light through the front window seemed warmer now, as if the shop itself understood that something beautiful was starting to take root. As evening fell, Harvey would often stay late, turning the sign in the window from open to closed without locking the door. Neighbors and friends would wander in for the last cup of coffee, the one that was always waiting. The street outside would quiet down, the fog returning in soft ribbons around the streetlights. Inside, the low murmur of voices and the gentle clink of ceramic cups created a lullaby for the end of the day. Harvey would sit on a stool, his camera within reach, and he would photograph the scene, not for a campaign, but for his own heart, a record of people who were finally beginning to feel at home. Harvey Milk walked everywhere. He believed that to know a neighborhood, you had to feel its pavement under your shoes, to catch the expressions of people passing by, to stop and pet the dogs and admire the gardens. Each morning, he set out with a pocket full of flyers and a ready smile, his route winding through the narrow streets of the Castro like a vein through a leaf. The sidewalks here were lined with heritage trees, eucalyptus and Monterey pine, their canopies creating a dappled tunnel of light and shadow. The quiet beauty of his morning walks fed something essential in him, a belief that the ordinary fabric of daily life was itself the true stage for history. During these walks, Harvey became a familiar presence, a friendly face in a neighborhood that was learning to feel like a village. He would pause outside the Castro Theater, a grand Art Deco movie palace, with its glowing marquee and Spanish-tiled roof. On quiet mornings, before the ticket booth opened, the theater stood like a sleeping giant, its neon lines soft in the early light. He might then turn onto 18th Street, where small bakeries filled the air with the scent of fresh bread, and the flower shop proprietor was just setting out buckets of sunflowers on the sidewalk. Everywhere he went, he saw ordinary beauty and untapped potential. People began to trust him because he never seemed to be in a hurry. He would sit on a stoop with an elderly neighbor and listen to stories about how these streets looked before the freeway came through. He would kneel to talk to a child about school, or pat a stray cat that lived beneath the steps of a Victorian triplex. His compassion was rooted not in grand ideals, but in the textures of everyday life, the peeling paint on a fence, the taste of a shared pastry, the way the afternoon light slanted through a clean window. This, he thought, was what politics should be, not a distant game of power, but the art of caring for the things right in front of you. The neighborhood itself had a rhythm that changed with the hours. In the early morning, the streets belonged to shopkeepers unlocking their doors and delivery trucks idling at the curb. By midday, the sidewalks filled with a diverse crowd, artists carrying portfolios, students in worn jackets, young couples holding hands, older men with walking canes, their faces mapped with decades of resilience. Harvey watched this daily parade with affection, noticing who was there and, just as importantly, who was missing. He saw how many people still felt they had to hide, slipping through alleyways or keeping their love invisible even in this progressive pocket of the city. On one especially bright afternoon, as the sun hung over Twin Peaks and bathed the Castro in a honey-colored glow, Harvey stopped near the intersection of 18th and Castro and looked up. The houses here were painted in a joyful chaos of colors: mint green, coral pink, powder blue, each one adorned with elaborate gingerbread trim and tall, narrow windows. A climbing rose vine draped over a balcony, its blooms a deep crimson against the painted wood. A cat sat in a second-story window, blinking slowly. It was, Harvey thought, a postcard of everything he loved about this place: the beauty, the quirkiness, the quiet dignity of homes that had stood for 100 years and now sheltered a new generation. Evenings brought a different kind of quiet. The street lamps, with their old-fashioned globes, began to flicker on one by one. The fog crept back over the hill, softening the edges of the buildings and muffling the distant hum of the city. Harvey would often walk at dusk, his presence as steady as the lighthouse beam. He believed in the power of a simple, consistent presence. It told people that someone was looking out, that someone cared. People began to wave from their porches, to call out a greeting, to share the small victories and defeats of their day. The streets were not just pathways, they were threads of connection. One particular evening, as the last orange light drained from the sky and the air grew cool, Harvey sat on a bench at the edge of a small park. An old oak tree spread its branches overhead, its leaves rustling with the same soft sound he remembered from childhood summers. A few blocks away, the muffled laughter of a dinner party drifted from an open window. He pulled out a small notebook, not to write a speech or a strategy, but to jot down a line he wanted to remember: "Hope is something you give yourself." He understood, in that small, quiet moment, that the greatest gift he could offer his community was not a policy or a vote, it was the permission to hope at all. By the middle of the 1970s, Harvey Milk had decided to run for office. At first, it seemed like an impossible dream. He had no political experience, no powerful backers, and he was openly gay in a country where such openness could still destroy a career. Friends told him he was crazy, opponents sneered. But Harvey understood something deeper. He knew that his campaign didn't have to be a loud, aggressive spectacle. It could be a gentle invitation. He started small, gathering a handful of volunteers around the tables at Castro Street. There, amid the smell of printer ink and coffee, they folded flyers and addressed envelopes. The atmosphere was more like a family craft night than a political machine. Harvey's campaign aesthetic was humble and warm. Flyers featured his photograph, his mustache framing a genuine smile, and above his face a simple slogan, "Milk has something for everybody." He stood on street corners, shaking hands and handing out leaflets printed on goldenrod paper. He wore a navy blazer and sensible shoes, and he spoke in a calm, conversational tone. He didn't shout or make grand promises. Instead, he asked people about their lives, listened to their frustrations, and offered a vision of a neighborhood that took care of its own. His kindness was his most effective tool, disarming people who had never met an openly gay person before. One of the quiet miracles of that first campaign was the coalition of volunteers it attracted. Grandmothers who had lived on the block for decades sat next to young drag queens, both carefully stuffing envelopes. Union workers shared coffee with artists. People who had never voted before registered just to support Harvey. The campaign became a kind of mobile community center, traveling from the camera shop to street corners to local bars, always carrying the same message: you belong here, and you deserve a voice. It was not a battle for power, it was a movement of visibility, one conversation at a time. The city of San Francisco, meanwhile, continued its own quiet rituals. On clear days, you could see all the way to the Marin headlands from the top of a hill, the blue of the bay sparkling under the sun. Each morning, the ferries traced the coastline, and the bells of Saints Peter and Paul Church rang out over Washington Square. Harvey's campaign walked those streets, but they did so with soft footsteps. There were no political rallies with booming music. Instead, there were house meetings in cozy living rooms, where a dozen neighbors would gather on sofas and floor cushions, sharing tea and talking about their hopes. The movement was made of these small, intimate moments, strung together like beads on a string. Central to Harvey's message was the idea of giving people hope, not a vague, sentimental hope, but a tangible sense that things could get better if they worked together. He would often quote the line he had written in his park bench notebook, telling audiences, "You've got to give them hope." He wasn't referring to himself, but to the act of living openly and proudly. He believed that every time a person walked down the street holding hands without shame, they were doing the work of the campaign. Every family dinner where someone came out, every teacher who mentioned their partner casually in class, these were the true votes that changed the world. Harvey ran for city supervisor 3 times. Each loss was disappointing, but somehow the campaign kept growing, like a tree that strengthens its roots beneath the ground. He learned the streets better. He learned the names. He learned the small local issues: a broken streetlight on Collingwood Street, a dangerous bus stop at 17th and No, and he spoke about them as if they mattered, because they did. The gentleness of his approach was not weakness, it was a deep patience. He knew that lasting change arrives slowly, sometimes so quietly you can barely hear it enter the room. During one particular afternoon between campaigns, the light in Castro Street was especially beautiful. The sun streamed through the window at a low angle, turning the dust motes into tiny stars. Harvey sat at a wooden desk cluttered with papers, his reading glasses perched on his nose. A volunteer had brought in fresh daisies, and they sat in a mason jar on the counter. The shop was quiet except for the sound of a radio playing a soft folk tune. In that moment, the campaign felt like exactly what it was: a community loving itself into existence. Harvey looked around the room, at the photographs on the wall, the worn chairs, the faces of people who had become family, and he knew, with quiet certainty, that the time was coming. The election of 1977 brought a change in the air that even the fog couldn't hide. San Francisco had shifted to district elections, allowing neighborhoods to elect their own supervisors directly. For Harvey Milk, this was the window he had been waiting for. On a crisp November morning, the results came in from District 5, and the impossible became real. Harvey Milk had won. He was now a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, the first openly gay man elected to public office in the state of California. That morning, the sun broke through the marine layer earlier than usual, as if the city itself wanted to bask in the news. The victory celebration was not a wild party but a joyful, teary gathering on the streets of the Castro. People poured out of their homes, waving, hugging, and crying. Harvey walked the route he had walked so many times before, but this time he was surrounded by a growing crowd, a moving organism of hope. Someone threw daisies from a window, and the petals scattered like confetti over the pavement. The Castro Theater marquee, which usually advertised movies, was lit up with a simple message: "We did it." The scene felt less like a political victory and more like a neighborhood birthday party, where everyone was both guest and host. City Hall itself was a grand Beaux-Arts building with a towering dome that rose above the Civic Center Plaza. Its broad marble steps and gilded interior felt worlds away from the cozy clutter of Castro Camera. Yet on the day Harvey arrived for his first official duty, he walked through those heavy bronze doors with the same calm presence he had always carried. He was assigned a modest office with a window that overlooked a quiet courtyard. He placed a few photographs of friends on his desk, alongside a stack of papers about pothole repairs and trash collection routes. He understood that the poetry of politics lived inside the prose. Harvey's legislative work was grounded in the daily needs of people. He championed a bill that would ban discrimination based on sexual orientation in housing, employment, and public accommodations, a sweeping measure that aimed to make the city a fairer place. He also focused on the little things: better street sweeping, more accessible public transportation, a program to clean up dog waste in parks. He knew that dignity was built on these small platforms. When you could walk your dog on a clean sidewalk without fear of losing your job, life became simply livable. His voice in board meetings was measured, often carrying a touch of wry humor, but always rooted in a deep compassion. Outside City Hall, life in the Castro carried on with its familiar rhythms. On weekends, the park filled with picnickers and sunbathers. The bakery on 18th Street still sold Dutch Crunch rolls, and the cinema still played double features. Harvey made a point of returning to the neighborhood every evening, trading the marble corridors for the sloping sidewalks he loved. He would stop by the camera shop, now managed by friends, and listen to the day's stories. He never let the suit and the title change his fundamental practice: showing up, listening, and being simply, quietly present. The great dome of City Hall caught the sunset light in a spectacular way, turning the gold-trimmed rotunda into a glowing crown. Harvey sometimes walked through Civic Center Plaza at dusk, the shadow of the dome stretching across the manicured grass. He thought about the weight of representation, about being a symbol for so many people who had never seen themselves reflected in power. But he never let that weight bow his shoulders. He carried it lightly, as one carries a beloved sleeping child, carefully, tenderly, and with immense, quiet pride. Every letter he received from a young person saying, "You saved my life," was folded gently and tucked into his jacket pocket. One of his most profound moments in office occurred not during a heated debate, but during a simple, informal visit by a class of school children. They sat in a semicircle in his office, their legs swinging over the edge of two tall chairs, and he talked to them about what a supervisor does. He explained that his job was to listen and to try to make the city a little better for everyone. When a girl of about 9 raised her hand and asked, "Is it true you married a man?" Harvey smiled softly and said, "I love someone very much, yes." The children listened carefully, then moved on to their next question about the best flavor of ice cream. In that ordinary moment, history was being rewritten, not with fanfare, but with the honesty of a single, unhurried sentence. November 27, 1978, began like any other Monday in San Francisco. The morning fog was thin, promising a clear afternoon. The bay shimmered under a pale sun, and the streets of the Castro hummed with their usual weekday rhythm: shops opening, children walking to school, the distant sound of a cable car clanging up a hill. Harvey Milk rose early, had a simple breakfast, and prepared to go to City Hall. He kissed his partner, Scott, goodbye and stepped out into the crisp air. He had a meeting scheduled with Mayor George Moscone, a man he respected and admired, and there was routine city business to attend to. No one could have known, in that peaceful morning light, what the day would hold. At City Hall, the grand corridors were quiet, filled only with the clicking of typewriters and the low murmur of early conversations. Harvey walked through the marble halls, nodding to staffers he had come to know over his months in office. He carried a briefcase and a sense of ordinary purpose. The building, with its carved pillars and intricate tilework, stood as it always had, a monument to the idea that democracy could be beautiful and calm. The golden light from the high windows fell in long rectangles onto the polished floor. It was an atmosphere of warmth and dignity. History, as we know, records a terrible event that happened within those walls later that morning. A former supervisor, Dan White, entered the building through a side window and took the lives of Mayor Moscone and Harvey Milk. The details of that violence are stark, but they are not the images we choose to hold as the evening falls. Instead, let us imagine the moment just before. The last thing Harvey saw was likely the soft, dusty light coming through the window, the familiar scuffed floor of a building he had come to regard as a second home. Let us imagine that he departed gently, his spirit slipping out into that same light, becoming part of the city he had so deeply loved. The news spread across San Francisco like a sudden, silent shadow. In the Castro, people stopped on the sidewalks, their faces turning pale. The camera shop, which had been a place of so many hopes, fell quiet. Someone taped a small bouquet of flowers to the door. By afternoon, a crowd began to gather, not with anger, but with a profound, collective ache. They stood together, holding hands, whispering, crying softly. The sky deepened from blue to lavender, and the first streetlights flickered on. The world felt suddenly fragile, as if the very light had been dimmed. That evening, an extraordinary thing happened. As word spread by telephone and word of mouth, thousands of people began to converge on Castro Street, carrying candles. They came from every neighborhood, young and old, couples and singles, neighbors and strangers. They came not to shout but to be together, to hold the weight of sorrow as a community. The candles were simple white tapers, cupped by hand against the evening breeze. One by one, the flames flickered to life, and soon the entire street was a river of tiny, trembling lights. It was the most peaceful and heartbreakingly beautiful sight the neighborhood had ever seen. The march moved slowly and silently up Market Street towards City Hall. There were no loud chants, no banners, just the soft shuffling of thousands of feet and the glow of countless candles reflecting in the windows of the buildings they passed. The fog, ever present, hovered like a gentle guardian, softening the edges of the skyline. People looked into one another's eyes and saw their own grief mirrored back, but also something else, a quiet, unbreakable resolve. Harvey had once said, "You've got to give them hope." Even in loss, they were giving hope to each other, one candle flame at a time. When the crowd reached the Civic Center, the great dome of City Hall loomed in the darkness, its columned portico lit dimly from below. The marchers filled the plaza, a sea of peaceful, light-bearing people. There was no speaker's platform, no organized program, just a community standing in silent witness. Some sat on the cold stone benches, holding candles that had burned down to stubs. Others placed flowers at the base of the steps. The air smelled of wax, night blossoms, and the faint salt of the distant bay. Like the fog, a sense of unity wrapped around them, holding them steady. Then something simple and unforgettable occurred. From the edge of the crowd, a single voice began to sing a quiet, familiar tune, a song of peace and longing. Other voices joined in one by one until the whole plaza resonated with a soft, tender harmony. The flames of the candles seemed to flicker in time with the music. No one stirred. The harmony drifted upward, past the dome, into the star-scattered sky. In that moment, Harvey Milk was not a headline or a symbol. He was a presence woven into the light and the voices, a gentle echo of the hope he had spent his life nurturing. The night held them all, keeping vigil. In the days and weeks that followed, the light that had been kindled that night did not go out. It seemed to seep into the very walls of the city, coloring the way people greeted one another, the way strangers made eye contact on the bus, the way families learned to have harder and more honest conversations around their dinner tables. The camera shop at 575 Castro remained closed for a time, but when it eventually reopened as a neighborhood gathering space, it felt different, not grieving, but quietly gloriously alive, like a garden after a long, gentle rain. The photographs on the wall now included one of Harvey, his kind eyes looking outward, a small bouquet always resting beneath it. The neighborhood itself continued to change, but with Harvey's spirit woven into its foundation. Victorian houses were repainted in ever more joyful colors. New shops opened, a bookstore, a bakery, a florist, and the old trees along the streets grew taller, their roots spreading deeper. Every spring, the jacaranda trees on Dolores Street erupted in clouds of lavender blossoms, carpeting the sidewalks in purple petals. This was a neighborhood that had learned to wear its identity openly, to celebrate its own existence without apology. The children who had once sat on Harvey's stoop grew up, and some of them entered public service themselves, carrying forward a legacy that was never about one person, but about the unending power of showing up. The political work that Harvey started continued to bloom, too. The non-discrimination ordinance that he had championed became law, and its protection spread far beyond San Francisco, inspiring other cities and eventually helping to shift the national conscience. But the policy victories, as important as they were, felt secondary to the more intimate inheritance he left behind, the permission to be oneself fully, in the light of day. Every young person who opened a small business with the person they loved, every teacher who put their partner's photo on their desk, every family that chose understanding over rejection, these were the quiet revolutions that kept his candle burning. Harvey's own words took on a life of their own. The phrase, "You've got to give them hope," was stitched into quilts, painted onto murals, whispered at vigils for other loved ones lost. It became a kind of secular prayer, a reminder that hope is not a passive sentiment, but an active gift you offer to the world every time you choose tenderness over fear. On many mornings in the Castro, you could see someone pausing before a wall mural of Harvey, not to take a photo, but simply to be still for a moment, to let the words sink in. The mural itself, painted in warm yellows and deep oranges, glowed especially gently in the early light, as if it had absorbed decades of affection. The physical landscape of the city continued to offer its own solace. On the clearest winter days, the view from the top of Castro Street stretched all the way to the tranquil blue waters of the bay, dotted with white sails. The fog still arrived punctually each summer evening, wrapping the neighborhood in its cool, gray blanket. And every year, on the anniversary of that dark November day, people would gather again with candles, not to dwell on loss, but to celebrate how far they had come. They would walk the same route, their faces illuminated by the same soft light, and they would sing the same soft songs. Each year, the crowd grew a little larger, and the silence a little more peaceful. It is tempting, when telling a story like this, to focus on the moment a light was extinguished. But a bedtime story asks us to see a different truth, that some lights simply change form. Harvey Milk was not a president or a general. He was a neighbor with a camera and a lot of coffee. He was someone who walked the streets so many times that he wore the asphalt smooth. He was a man who believed that happiness could be found in the smallest, most everyday acts: a clean park, a safe sidewalk, a hand held without shame. His life was not a grand opera but a lullaby, sung softly and steadily, whose melody continues to carry across the hills of San Francisco and far beyond. And so, as we close this quiet reflection, let us picture the Castro tonight, long after the shop has closed and the theater marquee has dimmed. A gentle rain has just passed, leaving the pavement glistening. A single street lamp casts a pool of amber light onto the wet leaves below. A cat sits in a second-story window, blinking slowly, much like the one Harvey once admired. The fog moves in again, slow and sure, and the neighborhood settles into a deep and comfortable rest. In a window box, a single candle, electric now, but no less warm, flickers softly through the night, keeping watch over the sleeping street. The light it casts reaches every hidden corner, reminding anyone still awake that hope is not an achievement, but a quiet companion that walks with us always, long after the story ends, into the gentle dark.